video is about how to measure for swatches required in the Master Knitting Program, the Professional Knitting Certification, and other TKGA sponsored programs. We're very, very specific about how gauge should be taken, and that's why you would be measuring in this way. Now, I have a simple swatch here that is just stocking net. And notice that I have placed waste yarn on either side and at the top and the bottom. Those are to indicate the portions that I'm going to measure. You do not want to include the selvage stitches. You do not want to include the row where the cast on is or the bind off is. So I've placed them in the tops there. Now, when you measure, I've noticed my basic students, since I've been asking them to take photographs, will sometimes use a wooden ruler. And wooden rulers sometimes aren't quite as accurate. And when you place a ruler, you want to place it just like right where that marking yarn is. And then measure it to the marking yarn. And if you have it like this, or you have it like this, or you have it like this, it's not going to give you an accurate measurement. I prefer it if you use a metal or plastic ruler. I have difficulty with the quilting rulers reading them, but if you want to use one, that's fine. Now, I've got this placed right at the edge and right at the edge here. And oh, this is a dilemma. It's kind of like between, because we're measuring to 1/8 of an inch. It's kind of, well, when I hold it flat, it's quite clear where it is. It's 6 1/8, or 6.125. So measuring the width, you don't want to include the selvage stitches, and you want to measure between those marking threads. Now for the length, measuring rows is a bit tricky because I have the waste yarn, you can see here, in this row. So I do not want to measure that row. I want to position my ruler so that it is at the top of the next row. And then I want to position it so that I am measuring to the last row, which is right here, and that is 5 1/4. I do not want to include the cast on or the row where those marking threads are. Now, to finish the gauge, what I would do is I would then count the rows, divide them by the width that I've measured or the length that I've measured, and the same for the row gauge or the stitch gauge. I have a whole bunch of blog entries on how to do this. This is just about how to measure. Now, stitch patterns like stockinette are a breeze. You don't need to worry about them. I mean, you just count the number, and if I were to position that marker here, it probably wouldn't make that much difference. But for stitch patterns where there are multiples and row repeats, you have to be a bit more specific. Now, I've just done something here that I'll have my students sometimes do. I have the cast on edge at the top and the bind off edge at the bottom. This is upside down, and that's going to make a difference when I go to mark and measure. So I want to make sure that I can identify my bind off edge and my cast on edge. So here's a lace pattern that I have a border around, garter stitch border. And the pattern multiple is, oh, I forget however many stitches, but it is from here to here. The stitch pattern for this, and in my blog entry I'll have the chart for this, is from here to there, from here to there, from here to there. And you want to rely on your pattern to tell you what that pattern multiple is. And it is always better if you are using your gauge swatch to measure a full multiple and get all of the multiples that you've knit. Now, why didn't I put it over here in that first column of reverse stockinette? Well, because that's not part of the multiple. That stitch is added to balance the pattern on this swatch. Marking rows is difficult, and you want to position the waste yarn in the row before the first pattern row and after the last pattern row. And people have a lot of difficulty seeing this. And it's not all that hard. If I kind of stretch this out here, you can see that the pattern begins with a decrease. Okay, or so you think. But if you were to look at the chart for this, the actual row 1 is this row, the single stitch, that when I work those stitches together is produced. That is row 1. So the first row of the pattern is where the decreases are. Okay? Then at the top, a lot of people would think that this, let me see if I can get it from angle. This is the last pattern row. The last row of this particular pattern is a plain row of reverse stockinette. The next to the last row is the yarn over. So here is the next to the last row, and this is the last row. So I want to position my markers in the row above the last row. So if I were going to measure this, I get out my trusty metal or plastic ruler, and I position it here, and I position it right to, let's see if I might want to move that down a little bit. You usually want to measure these things at the widest part. And so this would be 5 1/4 inches wide. Again, doing this is not going to give you an accurate measurement. Now for the length, because I know that that is my first row, I position it in the first pattern row and measure up to the last pattern row, which is that, and it would be 4 3/8 or 4.375. And in the materials you get for any of our courses, it's going to give you those decimal numbers, so don't worry about it. All right, let's look at a cable pattern. And cables are even harder sometimes to see the first and the last row. The first row of this stitch pattern, and I have a stockinette border, is to cable the first row. And as with decreases, most people think that where I have my yarn placed right now is the first row, but that isn't. The cable itself is performed on this row, and the action of making the cable twists those stitches. So that's actually the row before. And at the top, the same is true. This is the last cable row, or the last cable row where things are cabled. That is the plain row that is worked after the cable, because the pattern has an even number of rows, and the even rows are generally just worked and the pattern is established. So I have my tops and my bottoms here. Now, as for pattern multiples, and I neglected, oh horror of horror, to put in waste yarn for the pattern multiples. You do not want to measure. This swatch has these lovely little stitches on the side, filler stitches, filler stitches, filler stitches. But I do not want to include the filler stitches on one side. I want to have just the pattern multiple. And if I look at the pattern for this, the pattern multiple is going to be from here to here. So here's a multiple and here's a multiple. In this particular case, adding those stitches would not probably throw your gauge off all that much, but let's say instead of 2 reverse stockinette stitches, it was 8 stitches of moss stitch. Yes, that would throw off your calculation. So you want to measure just a full pattern multiple, because that's how the pattern is going to be used on the garment. So to measure this, I measure, a full pattern multiple, and that is from here to here, and that is 3 1/4 inches. To measure for the length, I measure from the bottom of the row above, before row 1, to here, the last row, right below my marker, and that's 3 1/4 as well. So that is how you use a ruler in order to measure your swatches. It also shows you how to position the yarn. If you are a member of TKGA, in the fall 2021 issue, there is an article on identifying the first and last rows in cables and lace patterns. And it's called Stitch Anatomy, and it's part 3. I strongly suggest that if you are doing any TKGA work, that you read that article and apply. It will save you from resubmitting. It will save you from errors. Thanks very much.